Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you're listening to this. I am, of course, the Shredder, and the opinions I'm about to express, as always, are my own. And I wanted to talk about a story that was in the press just a couple of days ago with regard to Alan Sugar, and a few things that have been kind of floating through my head ever since reading that I really just wanted to put out there. Now, for anyone maybe overseas who doesn't know who he is, Alan Sugar is a very wealthy businessman. He's a member of the UK's House of Lords, and he's the host of the UK version of the TV show The Apprentice. And back in June, he was calling for an end to the UK national lockdown. He was insisting from his Florida mansion that because nobody he knows had died, the reports of the dangers of the coronavirus were exaggerated. Therefore, everybody needed to go back onto public transport, get back into shops, cafes, restaurants, bars, etc., and get back to work. And he was using the model of what he had personally witnessed in Florida at the time as the example of how to get everyone else in the UK out of lockdown. And this was despite the fact that Florida at that time had soaring cases of COVID-19 after they'd eased their restrictions, to where now, out of all 50 states, it has the third highest number of recorded cases with just over 1.3 million, and the fourth highest number of deaths with nearly 22,000. Now, he and the press have recently been trying to spin his stance as actually supporting the UK government guidelines and speaking out against the critics of the government, particularly in these last couple of weeks. Quote, "It's the irresponsible people out there who are not paying attention to the rules, and the rules are good rules, they're not stupid rules." Now keep those words in mind and compare and contrast them to what he said in the Jeremy Vine show back in June.
Look, I'm not a doctor and I don't want to be giving medical advice and all that stuff. The only thing I can say is that I've been here in Florida for 6 months. And so I've lived through the crisis, the shortage of ventilators, the no masks available, the no body wear available, the hospital beds being full up, blah, 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 blah. And I've now seen the transition of restaurants opening, tennis courts, for example, opening, golf clubs opening, restaurants opening 50% capacity. Shops have been open all of the time, quite honestly. And this has been going on now for 6 weeks. And so I just logically say, well, hold on, 6 weeks out, we've come out of this so-called lockdown. Who's dead? I'm not. I'm still alive. My wife, thank God, is still alive. So is everybody else I know. No one else has caught anything. So I suppose it's a bit of a clue there that says that maybe we've reached a peak, and maybe it's time for us to follow the example of America, or indeed France, that have opened up, or indeed Spain. I think Prime Minister Johnson, unfortunately, had the problem himself, and I think he's been a little bit too cautious, if you ask me, just slightly.
Now, in the last couple of weeks, Alan Sugar has had relatives die from COVID-19, which likely changed a lot of his perspectives about the virus. His sister Shirley died on the 30th of December from it, which is the story that I read, and just 2 weeks earlier, he lost his brother Derek. And he's not the first person to have a change of heart only after being personally impacted by something. The US talk radio balloon Rush Limbaugh, for example, he was staunchly against drug rehabilitation and treatment programs right up until he admitted that he was addicted to prescription painkillers. If we want some examples closer to home here in the UK, David Mundell, the former Scottish Secretary and Conservative MP, he spent his entire political career opposing equality for LGBT people right up until he came out as gay himself in early 2016. Even people on the left wing can be guilty of this too. James O'Brien admitted in an interview that he used to be really staunchly against abortion until he thought he'd got someone pregnant at the age of 16, and suddenly then started thinking about what does she want and her right to choose. And it would be very easy to make light of this, forgetting that neither of Alan Sugar's relatives were in the public eye or out there supporting his position. But what, to me, this really should emphasise is just how dangerous it is to give uninformed hecklers in the media a platform to put out misinformation, and how much more dangerous it could be to let them actually influence policies and guidelines. be it Alan Sugar insisting people get back to work because nobody he knows died, so therefore the virus wasn't a big deal, or the talking heads in American news broadcasts who told people there again and again that this is just the flu and nobody needed to be worried, which has largely influenced Donald Trump's response. I truly believe that Donald Trump has spent more time listening to the likes of Dr. Drew on Fox News than he has listening to Dr. Fauci. And even people in broadcast media in this country, such as Eamon Holmes on This Morning, saying we can't rule out 5G as being a cause of the virus, or allowing the actress Denise Welch to go on an unhinged tirade about how the government was scaremongering about coronavirus statistics. Or we've got columnists in print media like Toby Young, Richard Littlejohn and Alison Pearson getting everything consistently wrong, from claiming there was no danger from the virus to insisting there would be no second wave, or claiming that lockdowns are somehow more dangerous than the virus itself. Or in radio, Julia Hartley-Brewer, Majid Nawaz, and an almost endless stream of talk radio presenters lately literally suggesting as of late that because it's mostly been elderly people or those with severe underlying health conditions that died from coronavirus, that they're worth sacrificing to get the economy moving again. Boris Johnson is no saint. He fucked things up so badly from the start that his failures caused tens of thousands of needless excess deaths. Deaths which I hope once we have COVID-19 under control, he and his administration can be held to account for in some way by a public inquiry or even a judicial inquiry.
I'm shaking hands continuously. I was at a hospital the other night where I think there were actually a few coronavirus patients, and I shook hands with everybody. You'll be pleased to know, and I continue to shake hands. And I think it's very important that we, people obviously can make up their own minds. I think Matt has said that people must make up their own minds, but I think the scientific evidence is, well, I'll hand over to the experts, but our judgment is wash. Washing your hands is the crucial thing.
But I shudder to imagine how much higher that death toll would have been if he had listened to right-wing talking heads like Trump appears to have been doing, rather than scientific experts. With a current official death toll of nearly 75,000 in the UK alone, hundreds still dying daily to where we're almost back up to days where the daily death toll tops 1,000, and tens of thousands new cases being recorded to where we now have a new strain of the virus, even if we accept that the majority of the people who died were over 65 and severely ill, just what would the numbers have to be before somebody like a Julia Hartley-Brewer decided that something has to be done to stop the spread? How many people's mothers, fathers and grandparents and even sick relatives who are under 65 should the country be prepared to bury before Toby Young decides that perhaps it's maybe not a good idea to carry on as if nothing is really happening or the virus is just a minor inconvenience? The likes of them, Alan Sugar, Majid Nawaz, Dan Wootton, Richard Littlejohn, Alison Pearson, etc., will never answer that. But perhaps instead it might be worth asking the people who for some reason support them and tweet how they wish that Alan Sugar were the Prime Minister, or that Julia Hartley-Brewer is a voice of sanity and reason. Now, there was a very good Twitter thread published by Sam Bowman where he detailed a lot of things that were written and published in the Telegraph from Alison Pearson to undermine and belittle the scientific advice while promoting the discredited idea of herd immunity. Just to mention a couple of things that he highlighted, she wrote about how she was glad her son contracted the virus at university along with everyone else in the student house. She claimed that the government was pretending that this was a lethal pandemic. She repeatedly demanded that lockdowns were cancelled and said that people should be able to ignore the rules because the virus was restricted almost exclusively to hospitals and care homes. I'll leave a link to that thread in the description because it's quite incredible how wrong this one columnist has been on a consistent basis, and yet still gets paid to bloviate and poison the discourse about the virus rather than be sent packing for being a dangerous lunatic who destroys whatever credibility is left at the Telegraph every minute she remains employed by them. If I could, I would add to that her assertion that lockdowns, which were advised by the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies, otherwise known as SAGE, were anti-science and didn't save lives, but merely postponed death. As if postponing death is somehow a bad thing. That medication you might be taking, well, that's just postponing your death. Stop taking it and flush it down the toilet right now. And those safety features in your car, like the seat belts and the airbags, well, they're just designed to postpone death if you get in a serious crash. You don't really want to postpone death and wait for an ambulance or the fire brigade to come and get you out and treat your injuries. Best get those removed and just embrace a quicker death by flying through the windscreen. And by the way, Alison Pearson's qualifications in science that drew her to this conclusion that SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies, are somehow anti-science are a lower second-class degree in English. How someone this stupid is paid for opinion columns is one of those great mysteries that historians will probably debate in the future and still not quite agree upon the reasons for it. Now, Alison Pearson is aware of this thread and has replied to it. Well, I say she has. Her response was to instead retweet this response from her fellow unqualified heckler and talk radio presenter Julia Hartley-Brewer. A thread in which Sam Bowman criticises Alison Pearson for not wanting to live in a totalitarian police state where no one questions authority and people are locked in their homes for months on end without any evidence that lives are saved, and Sam thinks he won the argument. Knowing that experts have to compete for airtime and press space against these people makes my heart sink, because so-called news and media outlets would rather pay thousands and thousands of pounds to people with no qualifications or the vaguest appearance of self-awareness. Why else would people like Julia Hartley-Brewer, Alison Pearson, etc. not just be confined to social media, but given space in paid media gigs to whip up anger and mistrust with imagery of a totalitarian police state to describe people being asked to be inconvenienced to protect public health? That imagery is bound to grab the attention of people more, either because its simplicity backs up other people's own misguided beliefs, or from people like me who think that this kind of thing is batshit. And slogans, no matter how incorrect, meaningless and empty, are quicker and easier than doing the responsible but rather boring thing of giving time to experts and people who know actually what the hell they're talking about.
I think the people in this country have had enough of experts.
Even worse is the hecklers cultivate an audience who want their prejudice or want their simple views or their disgusting attitudes pandered to, so will jump on any minute detail that the hecklers may have got right and hold that up as overwhelming evidence while ignoring everything else. And unless it strays into areas of libel or criminality, there is no punishment for hecklers in the media to spread undiluted nonsense. The best example of that is probably the decades of front page headlines of lie after lie after lie about the European Union, from bendy bananas to bans on fry-ups to plans to force cows to wear nappies. And when you talk to supporters of these hecklers, it's a bit like talking to someone who believes in psychic mediums. Someone who goes to someone who claims to be psychic, gets a reading, and truly believes that this person claiming to be psychic is actually talking to the dead, will swear blind that a medium told them something they couldn't have possibly known and focus on that one single thing they got right, while ignoring perhaps 50 other guesses that the so-called psychic made that didn't connect in the slightest. And even when you point out these 50 plus guesses that were wrong, they'll still hold up this one thing that they got correct, even if in reality it was vague or only partially so. And much like the believers in psychics, the supporters of the hecklers will get very angry at you when you tell them the hecklers have been lying in the first place, rather than be angry at the hecklers who have been lying to them. And this kind of misdirection, misinformation, and spin from the hecklers in the media is why you get people genuinely claiming that Nadine Dorries, Andrea Leadsom, Ian Duncan Smith, or even the MP for Gammon and Walter Mitty, Mark Francois, somehow know more about the World Trade Organization than someone like Pascal Lamy, who is himself the former head of the World Trade Organization. Or people who will claim that because Mark Carney of the Bank of England worked hard to make sure that his worst-case forecasts didn't come true, then he was somehow a liar when his worst-case forecast didn't happen. But of course, should any publication or media outlet ever decide that enough is enough, and you can only give so much space to people who have been routinely wrong about pretty much everything, they'll still get their fellow hecklers jumping to their defence and crying, "Free speech!" Again, without any irony of self-awareness, many of these same hecklers preach about the free market and how it should be able to do what it likes, but then they will try and justify why a media outlet should be forced to continue to employ and pay someone for services they no longer want or require. The Telegraph, for example, may look at Alison Pearson's Twitter feed and her previous articles for them, advocating for herd immunity and refusing face coverings. She's outright said that the human immune system is better equipped to cope with the coronavirus without a vaccine, which is patent crap when you look at the death tolls not just in this country, but around the world, even with social distancing, lockdowns, test and trace systems, and a functioning public healthcare system. If by chance the Barclay brothers, who own the Telegraph, looked at Alison Pearson's columns for them, and her previous writings for the London Evening Standard, where she whipped up scaremongering about MMR vaccinations by repeating lies from an American anti-vaxxer who's now banned from practicing medicine about thimerosal years after it had been taking out vaccines, and claiming that injections that were given to protect young babies from diphtheria, tetanus and whooping cough were causing autism, if the Barclay brothers looked at that and reached the conclusion that her comments were a danger to the public health by potentially undermining the current COVID vaccination programme, or ruining the credibility of their newspaper, or even if she was to start costing them a number of advertisers and they thought that was enough to get rid of her, then there is no doubt that Alison Pearson would be defended vociferously by her fellow hecklers. The likes of Julia Hartley-Brewer would no doubt dedicate an entire radio phone-in show and interview where she would tell her listeners that the ultimate point is that Alison Pearson is entitled to her opinions, which, by the way, is true. Alison Pearson is entitled to her own opinions, although it would be equally true that the Telegraph also have the right to decide that they no longer want to pay her for those opinions. This is the kind of thing that Katie Hopkins supporters failed to grasp when LBC and the Daily Mail sacked her. And they especially have the right to stop paying her for uninformed opinion pieces if they decide they would prefer to publish facts, something that the likes of Brewer, Pearson and the rest of the hecklers in the media are not entitled to their own versions of just because someone pays them to put pen to paper or sit in front of a TV camera or a microphone. But even taking out this unlikely hypothetical scenario of Pearson being sacked, since the Barclay brothers have shown with their dumbing down and dismantling of the Telegraph's credibility over the last decade that they aren't particularly bothered by facts, we can look instead at real-world comparisons. When people have lost jobs or even faced calls to lose high-profile jobs for saying or doing something that most of us would find objectionable, and for words or actions that would likely find the likes of you and I swiftly on the dole or potentially even in a courtroom over, these same hecklers in the media have been more than eager either for attention or because they have a warped sense of what's right and wrong or a moral compass that's completely broken to use their platform to offer up some form of defence. Be it after Dominic Cummings was discovered to have made his trips to Durham and Barnard Castle, breaking lockdown rules that the rest of the country followed to the letter, including not even being able to attend funerals of immediate family members for fear of spreading the virus. The hecklers were quick to change the narrative on his behalf of anger at what was a clear case of exceptionalism at the Prime Minister's top advisor thinking he was above it all, to it all being about Remainers wanting to have a go at the man responsible for Brexit. The same when Nigel Farage was let go from LBC after his comments both on air and on Twitter about Black Lives Matter, including comparing Black Lives Matter to the Taliban, all while LBC and their parent company Global Media were trying to acknowledge the protest movement of Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd. Talk Radio had him on as a guest the very next day after he was let go to talk about how he was silenced, how Black Lives Matter are dangerous radicals, and that he was forced out because lefties and Remainers hated him, and the work he was single-handedly doing to highlight, or more accurately in his case, demonise and exploit, the boats of refugees in the English Channel. Or even MPs who behaved inappropriately towards women. Julia Hartley-Brewer herself even jumped in to defend one when she was part of the story. Michael Fallon resigned suddenly as Defence Secretary in November 2017, and then news got out that he had placed his hand on her knee at a dinner in 2002. This was something that Hartley-Brewer said she wasn't at all bothered by. She continued to defend him, however, when more women who were bothered by his behaviour came forward with stories of their own, which included lewd comments he'd made to a fellow Tory MP, which was Andrea Leadsom, and forcing himself on an Observer journalist, which was Jane Merrick. But of course, Hartley-Brewer wasn't bothered by this. Her logic was, and typically is in most stories about sexual misconduct, that complaints are overblown, women exaggerate, and this generation is far too sensitive. Which is quite a bitter pill to swallow, particularly when this is the same mindset of the current Prime Minister when it comes to things like the sexual abuse of children. When he went on the radio, he described the inquest into the historic sexual abuse of children as money being spaffed up the wall.
The question is where you spend the money and where you deploy the officers. And one comment I would make is I think an awful lot of money, an awful lot of police time now goes into these historic offences and all this malarkey, and 60 million pounds I saw was being spaffed up the wall on some investigation into historic child abuse and all this kind of thing. What on earth is that going to do to protect the public now?
Even people who are held up as intellects, like Richard Bloody Dawkins, who to this day I can't for the life of me understand why anybody would listen to him on social issues. He described, he puts forward this idea. He described the sexual abuse that took place when he was at boarding school, with teachers putting their hands down the shorts of boys, which included him, as mild pedophilia. And said that because it didn't affect him and probably didn't have any long-term impact on the other boys who were being molested that he knew about, he wasn't going to hold them to the same standard. If you ever wondered how the likes of Jimmy Savile, Bill Cosby, Rolf Harris, etc. got away with the vile, sick behaviour that they did for so long, I offer up these attitudes in the case of the prosecution. This disgusting mindset of how it didn't bother them, so shouldn't bother anyone else, or that it was a different time and different standards, or people who were touched inappropriately just needed thicker skin, and the hecklers selling this to their audience. As for MPs, Michael Fallon wasn't alone in his behaviour, but he not only found himself re-elected in part due to the hecklers and the media downplaying what he did, but some of his fellow MPs, who arguably did worse, were also allowed to carry on as normal because the hecklers were given the time and space to explain that there was really nothing wrong with what they did, it's boys being boys, it's a tradition of laddish behaviour in Parliament, or that all of the outrage was manufactured by opponents to undermine the government or to undermine Brexit, or both. That's why Stephen Crabb got to keep his job not only as an MP, but as the Welsh Secretary, when he admitted to sending explicit messages to a 19-year-old job applicant. Crabb was twice this young woman's age at 39, and I can't begin to imagine what it must be like for a young woman looking to get her foot in the door with a career in politics, only to be rejected and then sent text messages from the man who interviewed her, who's old enough to be her father, describing what he'd like to do sexually to her. That's also why Mark Garnier got to keep his job as the UK's International Trade Secretary when he admitted to calling a parliamentary age sugar tits and sending her into a sex shop to buy vibrators for both his wife and a colleague in his constituency office. The Tories didn't even think this warranted a dismissal from the cabinet. And just so nobody thinks I'm picking exclusively on the Tories, for the record, I'm not for one moment suggesting that inappropriate behaviour is exclusive to their party. Simon Danczuk, when he was a Labour MP, was sending explicit sexually explicit text messages to a 17-year-old campaign worker, which is more sickening when you remember that this was just 1 year older than some of the girls who'd been groomed in Rotherham, and at the time he was nearly 50. There's the convicted paedophile Eric Joyce. He was having an affair with the teenage campaign worker when he was who was still in high school when he was a member of the Labour Party. He was an MP for them. And Derek Mackay, who was the SNP's finance spokesman in the Scottish Parliament, was grooming a 16-year-old schoolboy through a series of unwanted text messages. It's just in their cases, Labour and the SNP took action to suspend and eventually expel them from the party, whereas the Tories just considered it a minor inconvenience or a small blemish on their records before putting them up for re-election as MPs. And of course there was that list of about 40 Tory MPs that was leaked online a couple of years ago with a brief summary of the sexual dirt that the Whip's office had on them, should they ever need to use it, with everything from adultery and sleeping with prostitutes and rent boys, to allegations of pedophilia and rape. Although thinking about it, it does make me question what the reaction in some corners of the media would have been if Danchuk and Mackay had instead been wearing blue rosettes. And when the hecklers in the media are given this much power and influence to spin any kind of disgusting behaviour and push false narratives, spin and junk science out into the public space more than the victims, the whistleblowers and the experts, is it any wonder that the public discourse is so poisonous and some of the most wretched people get to carry on as if it's just another day at the office? And it's not even limited to things that could be remotely described as political issues or the pandemic. The hecklers have been allowed to poison just about every single issue. If you objected to Neil Oliver being the chair of the National Trust for Scotland, then it can't be on the grounds that he has no respect for the history of Scotland and bastardises it for his television programmes. It has to be purely because you're in the SNP and against him on the constitutional question. Even though his predecessor Kenneth Calman was himself a unionist, but was respected on both sides of the constitutional debate. If you didn't think Toby Young was qualified to be appointed England's universities regulator, it couldn't be because of his grotesque comments about disabled students. It had to be a cheap swipe at the government or just personal jealousy of the man himself. Even in the context of Black Lives Matter, the hecklers will stand up for the racists at Millwall who booed players taking the knee before kickoff. Honestly, when I heard Majid Nawaz on the radio defend the booing from Millwall fans, the same Millwall fans who have been fined repeatedly and are pretty much recognised as being among the most racist supporters in English football, and describing the booing of that momentary anti-racism gesture for players before kickoff being a poorly thought out protest from working class people, I swore I was having deja vu and I'd heard this kind of defence before. You know, when you get a tune stuck in your head and you spend days wondering, where have I heard this? What song is this? I swore I'd heard this before, and then it hit me all of a sudden, a bolt out of the blue. It was Carl Benjamin and his defence at an EDL member in a Vice documentary, casually throwing around the N-word to describe black people and frequently interchanging whether his problem was with Muslims or Pakis, wasn't a racist. An EDL member, which if he'd bothered to watch the documentary rather than just a minute-long clip on YouTube, he would have also heard this guy saying that he wanted to terrorise every Paki and Muslim to leave the country, and that he wanted another terrorist attack to get people to start attending EDL rallies again. And this was defended as him being working class and not racist. How on earth has it got to the stage where a commercial radio station like LBC pays someone and gives them a platform to use the same warped logic as the guy who's most famous for putting the final nails in the coffin of UKIP by standing for them as a candidate and having to constantly answer questions on tweets about whether or not he would rape a female MP? Is this really how far we're going now? Where the opinions of fringe internet grifters and crackpots start to become mainstream among the media hecklers? Tune in today on Talk Radio. Dan Wootton will confront feminists over their responsibility for a demented misogynist virgin going on a murderous rampage. And then tomorrow on LBC at breakfast, Nick Ferrari will try to contextualise an MP who was caught having sex with kids by explaining that whether or not it's a disgusting case of pedophilia really depends on the child. Which, by the way, for the record, both of those are insane positions that Carl Benjamin went public with.
I was well under the age of 11 when I started having sex, and so what I like to do is put people on the other side of the argument. It's like, what you have to do is you have to say that someone like me, not anybody else, but me, that I was too stupid to appreciate the nature and quality of what I was doing at the time. So please convince me I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah, I think it's it depends on the child, really, doesn't it? Because some kids
that's what the Catholics say.
Well, it's true, and it's true though. It should really be a case by case basis. But I can see why the whole thing. But it's not really something I'd ever put too much thought into, to be honest.
Depends on the child, doesn't it, Carl?
Okay, Jim. Yeah,
does it depend on the child, Carl? Does it depend on the child? It's all by a case basis. So you're cool. It's case by case basis. We get you, champ. We know what you're talking about.
Jim, it is scientifically verifiable that people hit puberty on a case by case.
Oh no! Please tell me about your ingenious ideas about 10-year-olds and 12-year-olds having sex. You're so smart. You're so smart, Carl.
The mental gymnastics that these hecklers in the media already perform to come up with alternative reasons for why people object to other people going unpunished or even rewarded for incompetence, fraud, racism, sexism, homophobia, or any other myriad of disgusting behaviours or comments, or to explain it all away, is quite incredible. God forbid they ever start going further down the rabbit hole where they start to normalise the likes of Carl Benjamin. And the hecklers themselves continue to get away with performing these mental gymnastics completely unpunished. There's rarely a drop in sponsorships, and their bosses are just happy that they generate an audience to let it continue. And they only step in when it gets really extreme, as LBC in the Mail did when Katie Hopkins tweeted about the need for a final solution after the Manchester bombing. Everything else she'd said and done before then was apparently justifiable. And the result of the hecklers in the media getting away with it for so long is that doing what most people would view as the right thing, or having a view that certain actions are contemptible and beyond the pale and shouldn't be seen as acceptable, is viewed by their audience as virtue signalling, or cuckoldery, or people just being meek and compliant sheeple. Whistleblowers and victims are automatically branded liars and political enemies. Experts are dismissed as part of conspiracies to control the population, and the villains are really the heroes, and those who reported on their wrongdoing are the real people we should be mad about because they've got another, more sinister agenda. So when the hecklers are given this much time and this much influence on the airwaves and in print, what hope is there for the rest of us who value facts, who want to hear from people who actually know what they're talking about, and more importantly, have a proper adult conversation? I'm the Shredder, and that's my opinion.